Handcuff the bastard. This impersonating piece of trash doesn't deserve to touch that badge. Evan Miller shouted straight into Jack Harlan's face in the middle of a packed coffee shop, in front of dozens of phones pointed like gun barrels. An old veteran was shoved hard, staggered, then the sound of metal cuffs snapping shut rang out, cold and dry, like a sentence delivered on the spot. The crowd sneered, satisfied, and somewhere above it all, Robert Kane, the name behind every decision, needed only silence to crush a man. But only seconds later, in a single moment, the entire room froze. A gray-haired man stood up from the back row, not shouting, not arguing, not needing to prove anything. He said just one sentence, slow and cold, enough to turn everything upside down. He's not an impersonator. He was erased from the records. Jack Harlan is not a thief of honor. He is a man buried alive on paper to cover a mistake the entire system refused to admit. A person forced into silence so others could keep their seats, their power, their clean outer shell. If you were Jack Harlan, what would you do? Stand up and tear apart the system that choked you your whole life? Or stay silent so your family could be left alone, so the truth could die one more time? And in the end, who is the one who truly deserves to be in handcuffs? If this segment makes you angry, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the rest of this story, and leave a comment telling me, would you stand up, or would you stay silent? The summer noon spilled over the coastal town in California like a layer of hot dust. Wind from the ocean blew along the main street, but was not cool enough, carrying only the smell of salt and the distant sound of breaking waves. Harbor Cup, the cafe on the corner facing the harbor, was crowded. Orders were called out continuously. Laughter overlapped. Metal chairs scraped across the tiled floor, blending into a familiar sound of ordinary middays. People came here to escape the sun, to meet, to kill time, and to see familiar faces repeating every day. In the corner by the window, where the sunlight slanted in just enough to not be too harsh, Jack Harlan sat alone. He sat there almost every day, at the same table, the same chair, the same cup of black coffee that had gone cold at some unknown point. His work shirt was faded, the collar slightly worn, as if it had gone through more washes than necessary. His prematurely gray hair was cut neatly, not elaborate, not stylish. His hands were large and rough, placed around the cup as if it were the only thing keeping him connected to this noon. Jack looked at no one, his eyes resting on the space beyond the glass, where the sea shimmered so brightly, it was hard to tell where water ended and where light began. People in the cafe were used to that image. Jack was part of the setting, like the coffee machine behind the counter or the menu board on the wall. He spoke little, and if he spoke, it was usually a few scattered sentences, polite enough not to be considered rude. Sometimes, on rare evenings when he drank more than usual, people heard him casually mention nights no one wants to remember, but no one asked further. In this town, people respected each other's silence, at least on the surface. On Jack's old collar, there was a small silver badge, chipped at one corner. It was not bright, not polished, looking more like something forgotten by time than something worth showing off. Jack did not wear it as a statement. Most of the time, he himself forgot it was there. Only occasionally, when his thoughts drifted somewhere distant, would his hand unconsciously touch his collar, his fingers stopping exactly where the badge lay, lightly, like touching an old scar that had healed, but never disappeared. That noon should have passed like any other day, if not for Derek Pruitt's gaze. Derek sat at a table near the counter with two friends. He was the kind of person everyone in town recognized, not close, not disliked, but always present in small talk. When Jack leaned slightly to set his coffee down, his collar shifted, and the badge showed in the sunlight. Derek saw it. His gaze did not linger out of curiosity. It lingered out of discomfort, as if something had touched an invisible boundary. Derek narrowed his eyes, tilted his head to look more closely, then glanced at his friend. He did not smile. His lips pressed together, his face tightening in the way of someone who felt offended, even without knowing why. A seal. In this town, Derek muttered, his voice low enough that no one outside the table could hear, but clear enough to carry contempt. The friend beside him glanced over and shrugged, as if it had nothing to do with him. Derek did not release his gaze. In his mind, the badge was not just an object. It carried with it something everyone in this small town was sensitive to. Military honor, an honor that was both genuine pride and an excuse to judge anyone who seemed undeserving. Jack caught fragments. The noise in the cafe was too much to separate every word, but that voice was sharp enough to get through. He did not turn his head. He only pulled his collar a little lower, a small, nearly unconscious movement, as if shielding a part of himself that should not be seen. The badge disappeared under the faded fabric, and Jack sat still again, his eyes returning to the sea. To Derek, that gesture was not privacy. It looked like avoidance. He took out his phone, opened the camera, pretending to check messages. His fingers trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anger. He angled the phone and quickly took a photo, clear enough to show the badge, blurred enough to avoid confrontation. A few seconds later, the photo was posted to the town's community group. Derek typed a short line without much thought. Someone is playing hero to get sympathy. He hit the post, put the phone down, took a sip of coffee, as if he had just finished something ordinary. Jack still sat by the window. He did not know that at that moment, his image was spreading beyond the cafe, crossing the hot street, passing through casual conversations, appearing on the phone screens of hundreds of people. He did not know that the story of him had just been placed into the hands of a crowd always ready to judge. The coffee in front of him was still cold. Outside, the sea was still bright. In Derek's pocket, the phone began vibrating continuously with new notifications, short and rapid. Jack had no idea that he had just been placed in the virtual square of the entire town, where no eyes needed to meet him directly, yet were still sharp enough to cause harm. Derek's post did not stay still on the screen. It spread in the familiar way of a small town, faster than storm news, slower than a traffic accident, but steady enough that no one could pretend they had not seen it. Within the first few minutes, reaction icons began to appear. Then words followed. The first person asked for clarification. The second mocked. The third cursed outright. The speed did not pull Jack into it immediately, but it created something more dangerous, an atmosphere already shaped before he had a chance to step out of the corner of the cafe. The comments split clearly into two streams. One side was cautious, reminding each other that the truth was still unknown. The other was harsher, using short, blunt, decisive sentences. The tone of the latter was always louder, more final, as if they were speaking on behalf of something the whole town was reluctant to say out loud. Among them were familiar names, people who had once worn uniforms, once stood at flag ceremonies on holidays, and once been respected for their past. One account with an American flag as its profile picture wrote directly, "I hate imposters the most." That line received more likes than any careful question. It was short, clean, and gave readers the feeling of standing on the side of righteousness. Others followed, without needing more information, only shared emotion. Words like honor, insult, and fraud appeared more densely, as if the story already had a conclusion. Jack did not know any of this. He was still sitting at Harbor Cup, with the same old coffee, the same window facing the sea, but the atmosphere in the cafe began to change. Conversations around him slowed. Eyes that had once only glanced, now lingered longer. Some looked and turned away at once. Some looked and whispered to the person beside them. Small movements, but added together they formed the feeling of being watched, of being placed at the center of an invisible circle. A man at the table behind turned his chair halfway around and looked straight at Jack. The look carried no curiosity. It was more like an unasked question. Jack sensed it, but did not respond. He bent down, lifted the coffee cup, took a small sip, then set it down, as if keeping the rhythm of normal routine might return things to how they were. But small towns rarely allow anyone to remain still. Once a story has begun, another person stood up, the chair scraping louder than necessary. The man did not approach right away. He just stood there, enough to draw the attention of nearby tables. Then he pointed straight at Jack, his voice loud and clear, needing no microphone. "Who did you take that from, huh?" The question dropped into the cafe like a heavy object. A few people let out soft laughs, short and cut off, as if to release their own tension. The laughter carried no clear malice, but it was enough to make the air feel tight. Someone nudged a friend and muttered, "I told you," with the certainty of someone who believed they already knew the answer. Jack looked up. His eyes met the speaker, then moved across the faces watching him. He did not answer the question. He did not apologize. He did not argue. Instead, his shoulders stiffened, and his hand came up to his chest, covering the collar in a reflex so fast even he did not have time to think. It was a protective movement, like when someone's hand comes too close to a wound that has not healed. The gesture lasted less than a second, but it was clear enough, and to a crowd searching for a sign, it looked like confirmation. A phone was raised, close enough that Jack could see the screen reflecting the cafe lights. The camera indicator glowed red. The person holding it did not ask, did not seek permission, just kept the phone steady, as if recording a moment that needed to be preserved. "Get it clearly," someone said from behind, more excited than necessary. "Let's see how he reacts." Jack looked into the lens for a brief moment. His eyes held no anger, no pleading. They were tired, deep, like the eyes of someone who had seen enough things he did not want to explain again. He moved his hand slightly higher, holding the collar tighter, the badge disappearing completely from view. A woman near the window shook her head and whispered to her friend, "You can tell there's something wrong." Another added, "If it were real, he wouldn't hide it." Those words did not need to be loud. They spread quickly because they fit the thought already forming. Derek sat at his table, watching the scene first through his phone, then looking up directly. His screen still vibrated lightly with new notifications. He did not smile. On his face was the tension of someone who had pushed a stone down a slope and realized it was rolling faster than expected. But when he saw Jack cover his chest, Derek exhaled, as if his belief had just been reinforced. "See," he said to his friend, his voice low enough for only their table to hear. "I knew it." In that moment, Jack was no longer just a man drinking coffee. He became a story unfolding in front of everyone, with a role already assigned. Judgment was no longer confined to phone screens. It entered the cafe, stood between the tables, hung in the hot, midday air. Jack felt the room shrink. The coffee machine behind the counter still hummed steadily, but it sounded farther away. The waves outside still broke, but no longer felt cool. He took a slow breath, keeping his hand on his chest, as if letting go would expose what lay beneath and drag even more with it. No one stepped in to stop it. No one said he should be left alone. The others chose the safer option, watching, whispering, returning to their tables while still listening closely. Their silence was not neutral. It sided with the louder voice. That simple, instinctive act of hiding became evidence in the eyes of the crowd, and as Jack remained there, hand gripping his collar, eyes not seeking forgiveness, the entire cafe seemed to agree on one thing: that the man in the corner was hiding some kind of guilt, even though no one truly knew what it was. Harbor Cup had not yet settled after the stares and whispers when the glass door at the front opened. The doorbell rang out with a short, sharp sound, cutting through the cafe's familiar noise. Some people turned their heads immediately, out of reflex. Others were slower, but soon everyone recognized the difference. Not because the person who entered was tall or dressed strikingly, but because of the way he paused for a very brief beat, long enough to observe, long enough to establish the order of the room, before moving on. Lieutenant Evan Miller stepped into Harbor Cup at its busiest hour. His police uniform was crisp, the shoulder seams neat, the belt heavy with things everyone knew the purpose of. His eyes swept quickly across the cafe, not lingering on anyone, yet missing nothing. The look was more like a scene assessment than a search for people. Voices in the room dropped automatically, as if someone had just turned down the master volume of the space. Miller had received the call less than 10 minutes earlier. The voice on the other end was brief, carrying the familiar irritation of situations pushed up too fast. "Something is going on at Harbor Cup. Online is loud. Go make it settle." There was no request to investigate, no detailed instructions, just a vague but very clear objective: make the problem disappear. He took a few steps, stopping when his gaze landed on Jack Harlan. The older man was still sitting by the window, his hand on his chest, gripping his collar as if holding on to something that should not be touched. A few phones were still raised here and there. One person quickly lowered theirs at the sight of the police. Another pretended to review a video. Miller immediately recognized where the center of attention lay. "What's going on?" he asked the room, his voice just loud enough to be heard, not directed at anyone in particular. No one answered him directly. A few people pointed toward Jack. A voice from near the counter spoke up. "He's impersonating a SEAL." The words came out easily, as if they had been rehearsed. Miller nodded slightly and walked straight to Jack's table. He stood close enough to apply pressure, but did not lean down. "Name," he said, briefly. "Unit, identification." Jack looked up. His eyes met Miller's, neither avoiding nor challenging. "Jack Harlan," he said, his voice hoarse and slow. Then he stopped. No further information followed. Miller waited a beat. He was used to silence, but this kind did not feel like fear or ordinary defiance. It felt like a choice. "Unit," he repeated, his tone a bit harder. Jack did not answer. He kept his hand on his chest, his large, veined hand tightening slightly around the old fabric. In that moment, Miller saw the small silver badge with a chipped corner slip into view between Jack's fingers. The metal was dull, not bright, but enough to catch the eye of someone trained to notice details. Miller lifted his hand, the motion quick, as if to inspect it. Instantly, Jack tightened his grip on the collar. "Don't touch it," he said, His voice was not loud, not shaking, but clear enough for those nearby to hear. Miller's hand froze in midair for a fraction of a second, long enough for several people in the cafe to hold their breath. Then he pulled it back, his gaze cooling. "You are resisting," he said, his voice shifting into an official tone, the kind used for reports. A low murmur rippled through the room. Some people shook their heads, some whispered, some let out soft laughs. A voice from somewhere behind rose louder than the rest, carrying the impatience of a crowd already waiting for an ending. "Cuff him." Miller heard it. He did not turn toward the voice, but he knew exactly what he was standing in front of. Phones were raised again, faster than before. Red camera lights blinked. If he let it go, if he stepped back, the image would not stop here. It would follow him to the station, follow him online, follow him into meetings he would never attend. "Stand up," Miller said to Jack, decisively. Jack looked at him for another second. Then he complied. As he stood, the sound of the chair scraping echoed, louder than usual. Miller drew his cuffs. The metallic clink was dry, without emotion, carrying only function. When the cuffs closed around Jack's wrists, Jack jerked slightly by reflex, then stood still. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He only let out a slow breath, as if he had prepared for this moment for a long time. A few people in the cafe sighed with relief. Someone muttered, "Knew it." Another person moved in closer to film. Miller held Jack's arm and guided him away from the table. To Miller, it was procedure. To everyone else, it was the final scene of a small public trial. As they passed the glass door, the midday sun hit Jack's face directly. He squinted, then looked at Miller. The look did not beg. It did not hold anger. It was evaluative, brief, deep, and heavy. Jack leaned in slightly, close enough for only Miller to hear. "Don't wear a badge," Jack said quietly, his voice hoarse but clear, each word falling slowly. "If you've never had to use it to survive." Miller paused for a very brief beat, short enough that the crowd did not notice, long enough for the words to reach him. His eyes shifted, as if something had been nudged out of its familiar place. But then a small cheer rose behind him, pulling him back into the present. Miller tightened his grip and pushed Jack forward, as if pushing a case out of the cafe, out of sight, so that everything could continue in the order he had been tasked to preserve. The door of Harbor Cup opened, and the midday sunlight poured straight into the narrow passage like a cold beam. Evan Miller pushed Jack Harlan forward, his hand firm on Jack's arm, the movement clean, decisive, familiar, like completing an administrative procedure. He did not turn back. He did not look at the eyes behind him. He did not listen to the whispers rising like waves. For Miller, this moment needed to end quickly as possible. Inside the cafe, the crowd broke apart, not with a single loud burst, but with many small pieces of sound fitting together. People stood up, others leaned sideways to see more clearly, and some lowered their phones and then raised them again. There was pleased chatter, the tone noticeably lighter, as if everyone had just been released after witnessing something that matched what they expected. Finally dragged him into the light. A man said straight into his camera, his voice full of satisfaction. He did not need to look at Jack. He was speaking to the invisible audience behind the screen, the ones who would replay this video later with the same expression he had. Jack lowered his head as he stepped over the threshold, not out of shame. It was the reflex of someone hit by direct sunlight after sitting in the shade for a long time. But that moment was captured by dozens of lenses. In the frame, he looked as if he were avoiding something, as if bowing before a truth just exposed. The image would not carry the sound of his breath, or the slow rhythm of his steps. It only needed to exist long enough for others to assign meaning to it. The police car was parked at the curb. Miller opened the back door, pushed Jack inside, then shut it. The car door closed with a dry sound, cutting Jack off from the crowd, from the cafe, from a midday that now felt permanently gone. Outside, a few people still lingered, phones held high, trying to capture a few more seconds of the car pulling away. For them, the story was not over. It had just begun. Less than an hour later, the first headline appeared on the local news site. The bold line was enough to grab attention at a glance. "Fake seal, arrested at cafe." There was no question mark, no word of doubt, only a conclusion presented as an obvious fact. The article below repeated what had been said in the cafe, added a few quotes from social media, and a few comments from unnamed witnesses. No one asked what Jack thought. No one waited for a response from the man in handcuffs. The image of Jack lowering his head spread across the internet. Each time it appeared, it was cropped differently, placed beside different lines of text, but the message was the same. He was no longer the man sitting in the corner with a cold cup of coffee. He became a label, an example, a story used to remind others of a boundary they should not cross. In the car, Jack sat still, his back against the hard seat. The cuffs tightened lightly around his wrists each time the car jolted over a pothole. He looked out through the barred window, watching familiar streets pass by, slow and distant, like looking at a place he once lived but no longer belonged to. He did not think about the words in the cafe. He thought about the familiar feeling that had returned, the feeling of being pushed out of ordinary life within a few hours. The holding cell was small, the walls painted pale gray, a fluorescent light on the ceiling casting an even, cold glow. Jack was led inside. The cuffs were removed, and the metal door closed behind him with a short echo. In that room, there was nothing to look at for long. A wall-mounted bed, a metal sink, a blank wall. Jack sat on the edge of the bed, back straight, hands resting on his thighs, the posture of someone used to waiting. Time moved slowly. There was no clock, no voices, only the sound of footsteps occasionally passing in the hallway. Jack stared into the space in front of him, his eyes not fixed on any point. In his mind, old images did not rush back violently. They appeared in small, scattered pieces, as if they had been arranged long ago. He knew this feeling. He had been here before, in a certain sense. "Here we go again," Jack whispered, his voice so low it nearly blended with the hum of the ventilation. The words carried no resentment. They sounded like confirmation, a note to himself that the old cycle had returned to where it once stopped. Outside the cell, the story continued to run on its own. New comments appeared, videos were shared with different angles, and more commentary. Military honor was mentioned more than the truth. Outrage was fed by images, without needing more information. Jack did not know this, and at this moment, he did not try to know. Footsteps stopped in front of the door. An officer stood outside, looking in through the small window. He did not open it right away. He checked the paperwork, then knocked twice lightly on the metal frame as a signal. Jack looked up, his eyes meeting the window. "The prosecutor wants to see you tonight," the officer said through the door, his tone neutral, nothing added or taken away. The door remained closed. Jack stayed seated on the bed, letting the words echo in his mind, understanding their meaning very clearly. He did not ask anything else. He took a slow breath, kept his back straight, like someone accustomed to becoming the subject of decisions made elsewhere, by other people. His story had just moved into a new phase, one where he was no longer Jack Harlan, but a case waiting to be processed. The interrogation room was at the end of the hallway, separated from the holding area by a thick metal door. Jack was brought in when the afternoon was already fading. The fluorescent lights on the ceiling were already on, evenly bright, leaving no dark corners, creating the feeling that everything in the room had to be exposed, including things people were not ready to say. The room was not large, just big enough for a steel table, 3 chairs, and a recording device mounted close to the wall. There was no window. There was no clock. Time here did not need to be measured, because it was used as a tool. Linda Shaw was already seated on the other side of the table. She was in her early 40s, hair tied back neatly, dark suit, posture straight, both hands resting lightly on the tabletop. There was no sign of urgency about her. She was the kind of person used to letting others wait, and who knew that waiting would wear them down before the conversation began. When Jack was brought in and sat down, Shaw did not look at him right away. She checked a thin file in front of her, flipped through a few pages, as if reviewing the order of a script she already knew by heart. An officer placed the small silver badge with the chipped corner on the table, right between the two of them, then quietly left. The metal touched the tabletop with a soft sound, but it was enough for Jack to recognize it immediately. The badge lay there, exposed, no longer hidden by an old collar, no longer resting in a pocket as something private. Under the light, it was not brighter, only clearer, revealing the small scratches and the long-worn chipped edge. Linda Shaw reached out and used her fingertips to turn the badge lightly in a full circle. The movement was slow, almost indifferent. She looked up, her gaze settling on Jack, her lips lifting slightly. "Where did you buy it?" she asked, her tone half amused, as if asking about a souvenir. The question was not meant to find an answer. It was meant to place Jack somewhere, a place of someone caught with a fake object, questioned in a way where any answer could be twisted. Someone seated behind Shaw, possibly a clerk or assistant, let out a short laugh. The laugh was quick, clipped, treating the whole situation as a farce that was already obvious. Jack looked at the badge, his chest tightened, not from anger, but from something deeper, a reflex. In that moment, old images lined up just behind his name. A place, a night he had buried carefully. His throat went dry. He opened his mouth, very slightly, the first sound almost escaping, enough for him alone to hear it in his head. Then he stopped. Linda Shaw leaned forward a little, catching the hesitation. She did not miss the chance. "How stupid do you think we are?" she continued, her voice sharper now, the half-smile gone. "Do you think you can carry something like that around, in broad daylight, and no one will question it?" Jack closed his mouth. His jaw tightened slightly. Under the table, his hands trembled very faintly, so faintly that without attention, no one would notice. He brought his hands close together, forcing them still. This was not the first time he had sat in front of questions like these. He knew he was facing a familiar choice, one he had made a long time ago. Shaw leaned back in her chair, watching him the way one watches an object being tested for strength. "Do you know what impersonating military personnel means?" she asked, her voice, even now, like reading from a legal document. "Do you know how it insults those who actually served?" Jack looked up. His eyes were not fierce. They were tired and deep, like the eyes of someone who had heard these words too many times in his life, in many different forms. "I don't need you to believe me," he said slowly, each word chosen carefully, his voice low but clear. The sentence was not a challenge. It was a boundary being drawn. There was a brief silence in the room. Shaw narrowed her eyes, not in surprise, but in irritation. She was used to people begging, justifying themselves, or lashing out. Jack's calm did not fit any of those responses. It did not help her move faster, but it did not give her anything to strike directly either. "Then who do you think will believe you?" Shaw asked, her voice dropping, slower. "A man with no papers, no record, carrying an old badge and a few vague stories." Jack did not answer. He looked down at the table, at the badge lying between them, the familiar sensation of being forced to look at something he had always tried to put away. He knew that if he spoke, everything would open up, not just his story, but other things, other people. He had lived long enough to understand that some truths, once spoken, do not stop with the person who speaks them. Linda Shaw stood up, walked a slow circle around the table, and paused behind Jack for a moment. She did not place a hand on his shoulder. She did not need to. Her presence was close enough for him to hear her shoes on the floor. "Your silence doesn't make this disappear," she said, her voice lower but clear. "It just makes it easier to handle." Jack closed his eyes for a very brief moment, then opened them. He kept his back straight, his posture unchanged. He did not follow Shaw with his eyes when she returned to her seat. He was used to this kind of pressure. It was not loud. It was patient, and because of that, dangerous. Shaw sat down, placed both hands on the table, and looked straight at Jack. Her gaze now held no mockery. It was cold, calculating, like the look of someone who had already decided on a direction. "You can keep silent," she said. "That's your right, but don't think it will protect you." She leaned back and folded her arms, as if closing a chapter. "Then I will make the whole town not believe you," Linda Shaw said, her voice even, without emphasis. The statement was not a sudden threat. It was a plan spoken out loud. Jack looked at her. He did not react immediately. In his mind, the sentence echoed, terrifyingly familiar. He understood very clearly the weight of a small town, once it had agreed on a single story. He took a slow breath, kept his face calm, as if he had just heard something long foretold. The interrogation ended there. No more questions were needed, no more words. The badge remained on the table, unmoving, like a piece of evidence waiting to be attached to a story someone else was writing for him. Jack was led out, the metal door closing behind him with a familiar echo. On the other side of the door, Linda Shaw stayed seated a moment longer, then reached for the file, like someone who had just laid the first brick of a case she believed would unfold exactly as she intended. The courtroom was smaller than Jack had expected. The ceiling was low, the light a pale yellow, and the old wooden benches creaked softly whenever someone shifted. The morning air was heavy and dry, the kind of air found in places where people came to complete procedures, not to look for truth. Jack was led in through a side door, the Q-cuff removed, but the cold memory of metal still lingering on his wrists. He stood in the place reserved for the defendant, back straight, eyes forward, not searching for any familiar face in the crowd. The trial began quickly. There was no long opening statement. The judge read the name of the case in an even voice, like reading an item on a daily list to be processed. Jack heard his name spoken, short and bare, separated from everything he had ever been. He did not turn to look at the gallery, but he felt the eyes on him, eyes mixed with curiosity. judgment, and a faint satisfaction from people who had come to watch an ending they already believed they knew. The first witness called was Derek Pruitt. Derek stepped up to the stand, back straight, chin slightly raised, like someone preparing to speak before a familiar crowd. He looked toward the judge, then cast a glance at Jack. In that moment, Derek's eyes were not fierce. They were certain, the certainty of someone who believed he was standing on the right side. "I only did what was right," Derek said when asked why he posted and called the police. His voice did not shake. "I saw someone insulting the honor of the military. I felt I had a responsibility to speak up." The prosecutor nodded slightly, as if he had been waiting for that answer. No one asked Derek how certain he really was. No one asked why his anger moved faster than his doubt. The story was told neatly, cleanly, without excess detail. Jack stood and listened. He did not react. Each sentence reached his ears slowly, like thin blades, not cutting deep at once, but cutting long enough to hurt. He looked down at the wooden floor in front of him, crisscrossed with scratches, and thought about how many other stories had passed through this place, in much the same way. Then it was Evan Miller's turn. The lieutenant stepped forward, hands resting on the stand, posture correct. He did not look at Jack as he began. "I was present at the scene to maintain order," Miller said, his voice flat, without rise or fall. "There were signs of public disturbance. I followed the procedure." The judge nodded. The prosecutor asked nothing further. No one questioned Miller about the moment he hesitated. No one mentioned Jack's quiet words in the cafe. Those details did not serve the story being constructed. They were left outside the courtroom, along with the sound of waves and the smell of cold coffee. Linda Shaw stood when her turn came. She stepped forward, her eyes sweeping the room as if she already knew every position. "The defendant is a man who lives on sympathy," she said, her voice clear. Each word emphasized just enough to ensure it was not missed. "He created an image to hide the fact that he has no documents or proof showing that he ever served in the unit he claims." A few whispers rippled through the room. Some people nodded. Others turned to look at Jack, as if checking whether his face matched the description. Jack remained still. He did not argue. He did not look at Shaw. He let the words pass over him, the familiar sensation of being defined by someone else returning more sharply than ever. The judge glanced at the clock on the wall. The look was brief, but Jack noticed it, enough for him to understand that this trial was not meant to last. It needed to end before lunch, before patience wore thin. The prosecution had finished. The witnesses had said enough. Everything was in place. Jack knew this was his moment. If he spoke, if he said that name, that place, that night, the wheels of the story would shift off the straight track they were running on. He could save himself right here. He knew that more clearly than anyone. His heart beat slowly but heavily. His hands tightened at his sides, fingers stiff. In his mind, old images rose more clearly, not chaotic, but ordered frighteningly. He saw the faces of the people he had once promised to protect. He saw their eyes in their final days. He understood that if he spoke, the door would open, and what poured through would not touch only him. Jack swallowed. His jaw tightened. He relaxed his hands, kept his face calm. He chose to bear the shame alone, as he had chosen long ago. His silence was not surrender. It was a price he had learned to pay. The judge cleared his throat, looked down at the file, then up. "If the defendant has nothing further to add," he said, his voice tired, "the court will proceed." The gavel was lifted. The air in the courtroom tightened for a brief beat. Some people leaned forward, ready for the moment of conclusion. Jack stood still, eyes straight ahead, accepting what was coming as something inevitable. At that exact moment, from the back row, a gray-haired man stood up. He did not rush. He did not make a noise. He simply rose, taller than those seated around him, and raised his hand slightly, as if asking to speak in a room that was not expecting any more voices. The courtroom slowed. The judge's hand stopped in midair. Eyes turned toward the man. Jack had not yet turned his head, but he felt the shift in the air, a small but unmistakable disturbance, like a wheel striking an obstacle that had not been part of the plan. The gray-haired man who stood up from the back row made no noticeable noise, yet the entire courtroom recognized him immediately, not because he was tall or because of any striking posture, but because of the way he stood, slow and steady, like someone accustomed to commanding a room's attention without signaling for it. As he rose, a few people nearby hesitated slightly, as if unsure whether they should remain seated. The air in the courtroom, moments earlier tense from the raised gavel, shifted into something else, heavier, quieter. The judge froze his hand in midair. He did not speak at once. His eyes flicked briefly toward the prosecution, then returned to the gray-haired man. Linda Shaw frowned, clearly displeased by the interruption. She was used to controlling the rhythm of proceedings like this. Unexpected appearances were something she disliked, especially when they were not in the file. The man did not introduce himself. He did not ask for permission at length. He simply stood there, facing the prosecution table, his gaze calm, not defiant, but not yielding either. When he spoke, his voice was low and slow, each word placed carefully, as if weighed in advance. "He is not an impersonator," he said. He was erased from the records. The sentence was not loud. It did not need to be. It landed in the courtroom like a heavy object set precisely in place, without noise, yet enough to knock everything around it off balance. The courtroom fell silent in a rare way, not polite silence, but the kind that made people afraid to breathe too hard, as if something fragile had just appeared. Jack stood motionless. He did not turn around right away. He heard every word clearly, and for a very brief moment, he thought he had misheard. The sentence touched a part of memory he had long treated as non-existent. His back remained straight, but his shoulders stiffened, as if his body reacted before his mind caught up. Linda Shaw broke the silence. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp, carrying the irritation of someone pulled off a familiar track. She rose halfway from her seat, as if to reclaim control, her eyes fixed on the gray-haired man. He turned toward her, very slowly. "William Reed," he said simply, "retired general." The way he said it was not boastful. It sounded like information that needed to be placed on the table so people understood why he was standing there. Yet that brevity caused several people in the courtroom to shift in their seats. Some narrowed their eyes, trying to recall the name. Others leaned down to whisper something to the person beside them. The judge adjusted his posture, clearly trying to regain control of the pace. "The court has no record of you on the witness list," he said, his tone more cautious than before. "You are intervening in this proceeding." William Reed nodded very slightly. "I understand," he replied, "but I also understand what is being placed on the table here." He extended his hand, pointing toward the small silver badge, with the chipped corner lying in front of Linda Shaw. "That does not belong to a civilian." The statement carried no explanation. It did not need one. The people in the courtroom understood that this was not a personal opinion. It was an assessment rooted in experience that very few in the room possessed. Shaw followed the direction of his hand, then looked back at him, her eyes darkening. She did not argue immediately. She was calculating, not right or wrong, but consequences. Only then did Jack turn around. He saw Reed more clearly. The silver hair, the face shaped by years, the eyes that did not avoid him. There was no pity in that look, no hint of rescue. It was the look of someone recognizing something once known well, something buried for too long. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed," he said, using the name correctly for the first time, "if you have relevant information, the court needs to know what you are basing this statement on." Reed did not answer at once. He looked around the courtroom, as if measuring the level of attention. "I am basing it on records you do not have," he said, "and on records that once existed before they were made to disappear." A low murmur spread, then was quickly suppressed by the judge's look. Shaw remained still, her lips pressed tight. She understood the danger of statements like these. Once the story shifted from a man impersonating someone to a man erased from records, it no longer stayed within the bounds of a local court. "What exactly are you referring to?" Shaw asked, her voice now cautious rather than sharp. Reed turned back to her. "I am referring to people who served in ways that paperwork does not record," he replied, "and two reasons why they were never allowed to exist on paper." The courtroom fell silent again. Jack felt his heartbeat change, not faster, but heavier. He understood exactly what Reed was implying. He also understood that once these words had been spoken here, they would not be easily taken back. The judge glanced at the clock again, but this time not to hurry an ending. He was weighing something else, his hand holding the gavel lowered to the desk, but did not strike. "The court needs clarification," he said slowly. "If Mr. Reed's statement has merit, this proceeding cannot continue as it is." Shaw stepped forward one pace. "Your Honor," she said, working to keep her voice steady, "we cannot allow unverified statements to disrupt procedure." Reed turned to the judge. "Then verify them," he said, "through official channels, not here." The words forced a choice the judge could not avoid. He looked down at the file, then at Jack, then back at Reed. Hesitation showed clearly on his face. For the first time in the entire hearing, the familiar sense of control had slipped from his grasp. "The court is adjourned," the judge said, after a long pause. "The court orders the evidence to be reviewed through a higher authorized channel." The courtroom stirred again, this time without satisfaction. It carried unease. Jack remained where he was, listening to the decision echo, feeling as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He knew he had not been saved, but he also knew that what had just opened was no longer a simple escape. It was a dangerous void, where old questions began to surface, and no one in the room was certain they truly wanted to see the answers. The decision to suspend the trial came faster than expected, but no one in the courtroom felt relieved. It did not feel like a delay meant to clarify things, but like pulling the brakes when a vehicle had just hit something not marked on the map. Jack was led out through the rear exit, a narrow, long hallway, white lights shining straight down on the floor, as if allowing no place for shadows to hide. He walked slowly, evenly, asking no one what would happen next. He was used to this kind of silent transition, where all questions were saved for another time. In another place, the badge did not go with him. It was placed into a clear, sealed evidence bag, carefully labeled, like an item that could cause trouble if handled the wrong way. Jack glanced at it briefly as it was taken away, the dull metal flashing under the hallway lights. He did not feel a sense of loss. That object had long ceased to belong only to him. It had become a point of contact that too many people wanted to grab hold of. The review room was in another building, with no sign outside, no glass door looking out. The atmosphere here was different from the courtroom, less ritual, but heavier. A large work table sat under a specialized inspection light. The badge was removed from the bag and placed at the center of the table, and someone rushed to touch it. It lay there like something just unearthed from the ground, not belonging to the present. The inspection light was switched on. Under the harsh beam, the metal did not shine, but appeared rough, dull, with small scratches worn deep into it. A technician, a middle-aged man wearing glasses, leaned in close. He used a magnifying lens, adjusted the angle several times. The moment stretched longer than needed for an ordinary glance. "There's a number engraved," he said very softly, almost to himself, but the room was so quiet that the words carried clearly. William Reed stood behind him, arms folded across his chest. He did not step closer. When he heard that, he only nodded slightly. "That's how they do it," Reed said. No further explanation. No one asked him to explain. The statement alone was enough to confirm that what had been found was not random. Linda Shaw stood on the opposite side of the table, a file in her hands. She flipped through the pages, faster than before. No trace of her usual ease. Paper rustled steadily. She stopped at a blank page, flipped again, then returned to it. Her finger tapped lightly on the paper, an unconscious rhythm. "His name isn't there," Shaw said, her voice trailing off at the end, as if even she was unaccustomed to speaking a void aloud. Someone near the door, possibly a legal aide, blurted out a question, not aimed at anyone in particular. "If there's no record, then who is he?" The question was light, but it made several people in the room shift their stance. No one answered right away, because that question, if answered seriously, would drag many more questions in its wake. Reed stepped forward one pace. "We need to cross-check through a high-level military channel," he said, his voice even, like proposing a technical procedure, but that calmness stilled the room. Everyone there understood that once such a channel was activated, control of the narrative would no longer rest with the people standing in that room. Shaw looked at Reed, then back at the badge. She did not object immediately. She was weighing not just legalities, but consequences. Sending the case upward meant more eyes would look at it, and not all eyes were willing to see things that had been buried for a long time. The judge was brought into the room. A few minutes later, he entered, glanced over the table, the faces gathered there, then stopped at the badge beneath the inspection light. He did not ask much. He heard the brief report, heard the request for verification. When he gave his decision, he did not lift the gavel as before. "The hearing is suspended," he said, his voice slow, choosing each word. "The court orders the evidence to be reviewed through a higher authorized channel." The words ended the meeting, but not the tension. No one left immediately. People stood still for a few beats, as if making sure they had heard correctly. Then one by one they dispersed, carrying different thoughts about what they had just touched. Jack was taken back to the temporary holding facility late in the afternoon. The familiar hallway appeared before him again, long and narrow. He walked on, arms hanging at his sides. No cuffs now, yet the sense of being held remained. As he passed a duty officer, the man looked at him for a second, then spoke as if talking about the weather, his tone entirely ordinary. "You'll be questioned more tonight." Jack did not turn around. He did not ask who would question him, about what, or where. He looked only at the gray wall ahead, where peeling paint formed meaningless shapes. He had heard that phrase before, in another context, another time. He knew very well what more questioning meant, and he knew that from the moment that small number appeared under the light, the door had opened, quietly, but wide enough for things long hidden to begin finding their way back. Night settled over the detention facility slowly and evenly, carrying no obvious threat. The hallway lights stayed as bright as daytime, the kind of white light that made it hard to tell the hour. All loud sounds had long faded. Only the ventilation fans turned steadily overhead, their rhythm repeating like the breathing of a massive body that never slept. Jack sat on the bed, his back against the wall, eyes open, not focused on anything in particular. He did not sleep. He did not try to sleep. In places like this, sleep often came when people lowered their guard, and Jack had learned long ago that this was not the time to do that. He stood up when he heard the hallway door open somewhere far off. No one called his name. No one signaled. He simply stepped outside by habit, as if his body was used to moving at hours. No one explained. The corridor was long and empty, metal doors sealed on both sides. Jack walked slowly, his steps light, not out of fear, but because there was no need to make noise. The public phone mounted at the corner of the hallway, a place few people passed, rang just as he walked by. Not a long ring, just a short, dry burst, like a programmed signal. Jack stopped. During all the time he had been here, he had never seen that phone used. No one called a detention facility at this hour, unless they knew exactly who they were calling. Jack looked at the phone for a beat, then lifted the receiver. He did not say hello. He did not ask who was calling. He simply held the receiver to his ear and waited. On the other end, there was a faint sound of wind, like a car passing through an empty parking lot. Then a man's voice came through, middle-aged, tired, carrying no tension. "Yeah, Jack, right." The way the name was spoken was not formal. It sounded like how someone addressed an old acquaintance not seen in a long time, close enough to skip confirmation, distant enough not to care. Jack replied very softly, "Who is this?" The question was not sharp. It was procedural, as if he already knew he would not get a clear answer. The voice did not respond to that question. It continued, steady, unchanged in rhythm. "Listen," the man said, then paused briefly, as if choosing his words. "Don't make noise." There was no explicit threat, no condition, no explanation. It sounded more like advice than an order, but that calmness made Jack feel a chill along his back. The speaker did not need to raise his voice. He spoke as if he knew for certain his words would be heard and understood. Then the man added, his tone the same, as if closing a call that never needed to last long. "Take care of your home." There was no goodbye, no pause for a response. The line cut immediately. The dial tone followed, short and even. Jack held the receiver for another beat, then set it down. His hand did not shake. His breathing did not change. If anyone had been watching, they would have seen a man finishing an unremarkable phone call. But in Jack's mind, old gears had already begun to turn again. He stood in the hallway for a few more seconds. The ventilation fan kept turning. No footsteps approached. No additional lights came on. Everything remained exactly as before, as if the call had never happened. Jack turned back toward his cell, walking slowly, not looking left or right. He was used to the most important things happening in moments that looked entirely ordinary. The cell door opened. Jack stepped inside. The light was still on. The wall-mounted bed, the metal sink, the familiar gray wall. But there was something else. On the bed, right at the center of the thin mattress, lay a sheet of white paper. No envelope, no seal. It sat there as if it had always been there, waiting for him to return and notice it. Jack paused in the doorway for another beat. He did not rush forward. He scanned the room, an instinctive check, even though he knew that if someone wanted to leave this behind, they would not have needed secrecy. He stepped closer, bent down, and picked up the paper. Ordinary paper, not thick, no strange smell. On it was a single handwritten line, the writing neat, plain, unfamiliar. "They are watching." No signature, no explanation, no additional mark that could trace the writer. Jack looked at the line for a long moment. He did not read it a second time. He understood it immediately. It did not give him new information. It only confirmed what he had just heard on the phone, more directly. Jack folded the paper and placed it on the metal table beside the bed. He sat down, back straight, hands resting on his thighs. His expression did not change, but, in his mind, an old map had come into sharper focus. That call was not meant to scare him into backing down. It reminded him that this game had never left the sight of those who once controlled it. Jack lifted his eyes to the wall in front of him, where the light formed a flat, bright patch. He thought of other nights, other conversations, just as brief, just as calm. He had lived long enough to understand that the most dangerous words were rarely spoken loudly. They were whispered, placed at the right moment, in the right place, so the listener would complete the rest himself. Outside the cell, the detention facility remained quiet. No alarms, no unusual doors opening. Everything continued as if nothing had changed. But for Jack, from the moment he lifted the receiver, an invisible line had been crossed. He was no longer facing just a case. He was standing before something he had tried to keep behind him for many years, and now it had found a way to knock, gently, just loud enough for him alone to hear. After the call that night, nothing exploded right away. It settled in a different way, heavy and uneasy, like the surface of water before a storm. Jack was still detained, but the rhythm around him changed noticeably. The guards spoke less. The checks no longer followed the familiar schedule. He sensed it through small details, the way the steel door opened more slowly, the way eyes lingered on him a beat longer. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew the matter had moved beyond the reach of a small coastal town. Elsewhere, hundreds of miles from Jack's cell, a closed meeting was convened urgently. There was no press, no statement, only a few large screens, a few faces appearing in rigid square frames, and a central voice setting the pace of the exchange. The lawyer representing Senator Robert Kane spoke first. He presented a request to transfer the case to internal handling, his tone formal, every phrase chosen carefully as if tested many times. "We believe allowing this case to continue spreading will cause unnecessary harm to the image of the military," he said, eyes fixed on the documents before him. An internal process would be more appropriate for addressing sensitive aspects. The phrase "the image of the military" was lightly emphasized, like a moral shield. Few were eager to pierce openly. Several people nodded by reflex. No one objected immediately. In rooms like this, silence was often used to gauge reaction, not to signal agreement. William Reed appeared on one of the screens. He sat upright, hands placed before him, eyes fixed on the frame where Kane's lawyer was speaking. When it was his turn, Reed did not circle the point, or to avoid exposing a mistake he asked, his voice even, without rise or fall. The question was posed as an option, not an accusation, and that was what made it harder to swallow. For several seconds, no one answered. Then another frame lit up. Robert Kane appeared, a face familiar to the public. Hair neatly styled, dark suit, well-fitted. He did not look at Reed immediately. He adjusted the camera position, almost by habit, then looked up. "You're speculating," Kane said, with a thin smile. The smile did not reach his eyes. "We all know there are things that must be handled discreetly for the common good." Reed did not respond at once. He looked at Kane through the screen, his gaze steady. "The common good does not include erasing a person from the records," he said. The sentence was short and needed no further explanation. The meeting ended without a clear conclusion. But that very deadlock made everything more dangerous. When people accustomed to making quick decisions could not seal a matter shut, they knew something had slipped beyond their control. Meanwhile, outside, the story began to leak along paths that were hard to contain. At first, it was only a few short lines on major news sites, mentioning a man erased from the records. No full name, no specific details, but enough for seasoned reporters to catch the scent of a larger story. They began to ask questions. They began to dig back into old files, rarely mentioned operations, gaps in history long treated as insignificant. Public opinion shifted slowly but clearly. Comments that had once condemned Jack now carried a different tone. People no longer asked whether he was an imposter. They began asking who had the authority to erase a person from all documentation. Those questions spread faster than any denial. Linda Shaw recognized this earlier than many. She read the reports, watched the curves of public sentiment change, and understood that the model case she had once been certain of had become something else, harder to control. Pressure mounted on federal agencies. When major media outlets asked the same questions, when names with weight began appearing in analyses, ignoring the matter became more dangerous than intervening. Eventually, a decision was made. The federal government would take over the investigation, not as a gesture of goodwill, but as a necessary move to retain the initiative. Jack did not know all of this as it happened. He felt the shift through the way people spoke to him, through how questions suddenly stopped, then resumed from a different angle. One morning, he was taken out of the detention facility, with little explanation, only told there would be a higher-level hearing. The car drove on, along roads he did not recognize. He looked out the window, not trying to guess where he was being taken. He had learned that in moments like this, guessing wrong was more dangerous than not guessing at all. The federal building came into view in the early afternoon, tall, cold, its glass surface reflecting the gray sky. Jack entered a long hallway, polished stone floors, amplifying his footsteps more clearly than anywhere he had walked in days. This was no longer the space of a small town, where faces were familiar. This was a place where everything was measured in rank and consequence. He was led through another corridor, less traveled. When the escort stopped to exchange paperwork with a security officer, Jack waited, eyes forward, and then he saw him. Robert Kane emerged from a side passage without a noisy entourage, just an aide a few steps behind. Kane walked slowly, confidently, like someone accustomed to hallways like these. As he passed Jack, he stopped, not for long. Just enough for the two men to face each other for a moment. No one else noticed. Kane adjusted his cuff, a small, almost unconscious motion. He lowered his voice, speaking as if in casual conversation. "You're still alive today because I allowed it." The words were delivered lightly, without threat, without emphasis. They sounded more like a reminder than a warning. Jack looked at Kane. He did not reply. In that moment, he felt with clarity the boundary between the two worlds he stood between. Kane gave another thin smile and moved on, leaving Jack standing in the wide corridor, where Kane's footsteps quickly blended into the building's ambient sound. Jack took a slow breath. He knew the game had entered another phase, and this time, the people facing him were no longer hiding behind phones or files. They had begun to appear in person, close enough for him to feel the breath of power just behind his back. The hearing took place in a large room with a high ceiling, light pouring straight down from above as if forcing everything to be exposed. Jack walked in at a slow, steady pace, his arms hanging naturally at his sides. The clothes he wore were simple, well-fitting, without any detail meant to draw attention. He understood clearly that this was not a place for performance. Here, every word was weighed by consequence. Every look carried the history of the person giving it. The senators sat in a row, different faces, but sharing the same cautious expression. They had read the files, heard the briefings, and watched the carefully prepared summaries. Yet when Jack stood there, flesh and bone, the story suddenly carried a different weight. It was no longer a case described on paper. It was a man standing before them, carrying years erased from every document. Robert Kane sat across from Jack, at a distance formal enough to signal decorum. He adjusted his cuff, a familiar motion, then leaned slightly toward Jack. When the attention of others briefly shifted, Kane lowered his voice, just enough for the two of them to hear. "You're alive today because I allowed it." The words were delivered lightly, without emphasis, like a reminder of an order he believed still stood. Jack felt his jaw tighten. A line of tension ran up his spine, fast, then stopped. He clenched his teeth for a brief beat, his hand curling by reflex. Then he released it. He had come too far to fall back into old reactions. Here, a strong response would only make it easier for others to dismiss him. The hearing began. The first questions were procedural, covering background, timelines, and the marked gaps. Jack answered briefly and clearly. He did not embellish. He did not try to impress. He let the silence between answers speak for itself. Some senators took notes. Others looked straight at him, trying to read something behind a face, long practiced at containing emotion. When it was Jack's turn to speak, he stepped forward and placed a small object on the table before him. The chipped silver badge lay there under the lights, not shining, but showing every scratch. The sound of metal touching wood was very soft, yet the room seemed to slow in that moment. Jack did not look at the senators right away. He looked at the badge, like something that had traveled with him for too many years, now set down in a place he had never expected to enter. When he raised his head, his gaze was direct, not evasive. The room was quiet enough to hear breathing. No one interrupted. No one cleared their throat. The people present understood that this moment did not need to be pushed. "It doesn't prove who I am," Jack said, his voice low, each word released slowly. He did not raise it. He did not need to. The sentence stood on its own, without relying on volume. He paused, letting the space between sentences fill with attention. Jack looked at the senators one by one, unhurried. His eyes carried no pleading. They carried a different demand, the demand that what had been covered be called by its proper name. "It proves who died in your place." The words came out clear, steady, without hesitation. They were not aimed at a single person. They went straight at the structure of power that had allowed those decisions to be made. A very small ripple moved through the room. No one spoke out loud. A few people shifted in their seats. One senator looked down at the file again, as if familiar lines had taken on a different meaning. Kane remained seated, but the hand resting on the table had tightened. Jack continued. Without length, he spoke of a unit that existed outside paperwork, of orders given verbally, of an operation whose consequences were never allowed into official reports. He spoke of people who followed commands, and of how a name was erased to close a larger failure. He did not give unnecessary details. He chose the essential points, enough for listeners to understand this was not a personal story, but a system. As evidence was presented, piece by piece, the room grew quieter. The comparison of the engraved code on the badge, partially declassified documents, and confirmations from those once at the same level of command. Each item was placed on the table, like a fragment, not loud, but enough to complete a picture. Robert Kane's expression began to change. The familiar thin smile vanished. He leaned forward as if to speak, then stopped. When an aide placed the final folder in front of the senators, Kane glanced at it, then looked up. The color drained noticeably from his face. It was not anger. It was the moment someone realized the story had moved beyond familiar control. The room remained silent. Jack stood there, arms relaxed, back straight. He had said what needed to be said. He no longer looked at Kane. He looked into the open space ahead, where the truth had just been set down, not shouted, but heavy enough to make everything around it shift. The days after the hearing moved at a different pace, slower, but heavier. The news did not explode into sensational headlines as many had expected. It spread the way official records do. One file opened at a time, one line cross-checked, one signature examined again. Robert Kane lost his seat, not in a noisy press conference, but in a brief, cold notice released at the end of the workday. A single line was enough to close a career built on image and silence. Sealed files began to open, not all at once, but enough to create a chain reaction. Names that had been crossed out, replaced by numbers, erased from official reports, were gradually called back by their proper names. Some families received answers for the first time after decades of waiting. Not every answer was complete, but at least those deaths were no longer left buried in vague footnotes. Jack followed it all from a distance. He was offered media appearances, encouraged to tell the story in a way that would spread more easily. He refused. He did not want to turn those years into a hunt or an anger stage. The truth is heavy enough on its own, he told an intermediary, his voice even, without emphasis. He did not need applause to prove that. Instead, Jack devoted his time to something else. He met people like himself, those who had been forced into silence, who had lived on the margins of records, carrying stories with no place to land. With a small group of lawyers and former officers, he pushed for the creation of an independent fund, not large, not showy, but sufficient to provide legal and psychological support for people who had lived too long in the dark. He did not put his name at the center. He understood that doing so would bring the wrong kind of expectations. One afternoon, after the necessary procedures were complete, Jack drove along the familiar coastal road. Wind from the sea blew through the cracked window, carrying salt and heat. The town had not changed much. The old shops were still there. The familiar signs still hung quietly, but Jack felt something clearly different. The way people looked at him had changed. There was no longer curiosity mixed with judgment, no more furtive looks, guessing at him, just glances, enough to recognize him as part of the place. No more, no less. Harbor Cup appeared at the end of the street, its old facade intact, large windows reflecting the afternoon sun. Jack parked, stepped out, and paused for a beat before going in. He looked through the glass and saw the cafe moderately busy, voices blending with the sound of the espresso machine. The familiar atmosphere carried no trace of what had happened. That lightened him. He walked in and chose the same old corner by the window. The table was still there, its wooden surface worn by years. Jack sat down and placed his hand on it, feeling the familiar texture. A young server brought a menu, looked at him for a second, then smiled politely. "The usual?" she asked. Jack nodded. No explanation was needed. The coffee was set down. Steam rose faintly. Jack took a small sip and tasted the familiar bitterness. He looked out the window, where the late afternoon light stretched across the street. For a moment, he remembered that summer noon when everything had begun with a small detail. He felt no bitterness. He felt a circle closing in its own way. The cafe door opened. Evan Miller walked in. He paused briefly when he saw Jack in the familiar corner. There was no visible tension on his face, just a very short hesitation. Then he went to the counter to order. When he turned back, his eyes met Jack's. He gave a slight nod, a nod without a public apology, without asking for forgiveness, just enough to say he understood where he had stood in this story. Jack looked at Miller and nodded back. Nothing more was needed. The two men returned to their own business. The cafe continued as usual. Laughter, conversation, the soft scrape of chairs on the floor. Life did not stop to wait for large conclusions. Jack slipped a hand into his jacket pocket. His fingers touched something familiar. The small silver badge with the chipped corner lay there, cool to the touch. He took it out, looked at it for a beat, then placed it back into the inner pocket. This time, he secured the pocket carefully, like putting away something that had finished its task. He did not need it anymore to prove anything. He was seen differently now, by the simple fact that he existed. He sat a little longer, finished his coffee, and listened to the sounds around him. When he stood, he left money on the table and nodded to the staff. Jack stepped out of Harbor Cup, the last light of day falling across his back. He did not look back, not because he wanted to forget, but because he knew he could keep walking without carrying a symbol to remind himself that he had survived. Jack walked along the street, blending into the thin flow of people in the coastal town. His pace was slow and even, the gait of someone no longer pushed by the past. His story had been placed where it belonged. It did not close with an exclamation point. It closed with a space wide enough for others to step into, for those once forced into silence to find their own way. Somewhere behind him, Harbor Cup remained noisy, warm, still a place where people came to drink coffee and talk about ordinary life. Jack kept walking, carrying the rare lightness of someone who no longer needed to prove that he existed. The story of Jack Harlan is not only about a misunderstood man. It speaks about how a system can crush an individual when silence becomes a tool, and honor is turned into a cover for mistakes. Jack does not seek an epic hero's tale. He only wants to live quietly. Yet that very peace comes at the cost of accepting erasure from history, of being stripped of the right to speak. The greatest lesson here is not found in the final victory, but in the question of how many people out there are living in silence, carrying truths they are not allowed to speak. When society is too quick to judge, too ready to believe in ready-made labels, wrongdoing does not need to shout, it only needs to be protected long enough. This story reminds us that justice does not always come from raised voices, but sometimes from patience, from asking the right questions, and from the courage to speak the truth at the right moment, not for revenge, but so that mistakes do not continue to repeat. If this story makes you reflect, please share it so more people can learn from it. Thank you for following along. We are committed to bringing you the most outstanding content. Do not forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more inspiring stories.